I heard my daughter-in-law's voice through the baby monitor before she realized it was still on. Honestly, we're so lucky, she was telling her friend Amanda on the phone, laughing that easy, breezy laugh she used when she thought no one important was listening. We don't even have to think about daycare. Barbara's basically just free childcare. 3 days a week, no complaints, and she brings her own snacks. Free childcare. Not my mother-in-law. Not such a help. Not even my name, really, just a category. A line item. Something you don't have to budget for. I stood in my daughter-in-law's kitchen with my grandson Eli asleep on my shoulder, 41 pounds of trust and drool soaking into my cardigan, and I smiled the way I always smile when something breaks quietly inside me instead of loudly. Let's talk about that Monday, I said to no one, out loud, to the empty kitchen, because I already knew exactly what I was going to do about it. I just needed the weekend to do it properly. My name is Barbara. I'm 66 years old. I spent 31 years as a payroll administrator for a mid-sized manufacturing company before I retired, which means I have spent 3 decades of my professional life doing exactly one thing better than almost anyone I know. Calculating, to the penny, what people's time is actually worth. Which made it all the more insulting in hindsight that I never once thought to calculate my own. I should tell you a little about the house I live in now, because it matters to this story. Frank and I bought it 34 years ago, back when Danny was still small enough to ride on my hip through the hardware store while we picked out paint colors for the nursery. Frank passed 6 years ago, quietly, in his sleep, the kind of death people call peaceful and mean it as comfort, though it never quite felt that way to me. Since then, the house has been just me, my garden, and 3 days a week for the last 18 months, 2 small people who fill it with a noise I didn't know I'd missed until they started making it. I tell you that because I don't want this to sound like a story about a bitter old woman keeping score against her own family. It isn't. I love those children with something close to the ferocity I felt for Danny when he was small, and I would have gone on giving them every one of those 18 months for free, gladly, forever, if I hadn't started to notice something underneath the giving, a quiet, creeping assumption that my time simply didn't cost anyone anything because I never charged for it, and because charging for it had never once occurred to me until the day I overheard myself being described as a category instead of a person. My son Danny married Rachel 5 years ago. She's smart, funny in the right company, and genuinely a good mother to my grandson Eli, now 3, and my granddaughter Poppy, 14 months. I want to be fair about that, because this isn't a story about a villain. It's a story about a woman, several women, actually, myself included, who let a kindness quietly calcify into an expectation until nobody in the family could tell the difference anymore. Here's how it calcified. The first sign came about 1.5 years ago, not long after Poppy was born. Rachel was going back to work part-time, and she asked, very sweetly, very reasonably, whether I'd mind watching Eli 2 mornings a week just until we get daycare sorted out. I said of course. I love those mornings, cereal on the counter, cartoons, the particular joy of a 3-year-old's laugh when you make his toast into a triangle instead of a square. Just until we get daycare sorted out turned into 6 months. Then 1 year. Then Poppy arrived and somehow, without anyone ever formally asking, 2 mornings became 3 full days, and daycare was never mentioned again. Because why would you pay a stranger $400 a week for something your own mother does for the cost of a box of crackers? The second sign came around the time Poppy started crawling. I had a hip replacement scheduled, nothing dramatic, a routine procedure my orthopedist had been recommending for 2 years, and I mentioned it at Sunday dinner, expecting the ordinary logistics conversation every family has. Instead, Rachel's face did something I hadn't expected. Not concern. Calculation. Okay, but that's not, like, during the week, right? She asked. Because Tuesday and Thursday are kind of non-negotiable for me at work. Nobody asked how the surgery went until 3 days later, and even then, the question arrived wrapped inside another question. How long until you can lift Poppy again? The third sign was smaller, but it's the one that actually kept me up at night. Last spring, my sister Joanne invited me on a 5-day trip to visit our cousin in Charleston, the kind of trip I hadn't taken in years, the kind I'd been quietly dreaming about since Frank passed. When I mentioned the dates to Danny, he went quiet in that particular way he does when he already knows the answer is inconvenient for someone else. Rachel's going to be really stressed about that week, he finally said. Her mom's out of town too. I don't suppose you could push it? I pushed it. Joanne went to Charleston without me. Rachel's mother, as it turned out, wasn't even watching the kids on the days in question. I found out later, almost by accident, that Rachel had simply assumed I'd rearrange my entire life around a schedule I was never actually asked to confirm. The fourth sign was the phone call I overheard through the monitor, the one that started this story. But it wasn't really the phone call itself that broke something in me. It was a smaller detail buried inside it, one I turned over and over that weekend until I couldn't ignore it anymore. Rachel had said, laughing, she brings her own snacks. I do bring my own snacks. I have been buying string cheese, apple slices, and those little cracker sandwiches out of my own retirement income for 18 months because it never once occurred to Rachel, or, if I'm honest, to Danny either, that the woman providing 40 hours a week of unpaid, professional-grade childcare might also be quietly absorbing the grocery bill for it. I did the math that weekend, sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad, the same way I used to do payroll reconciliations for 211 employees every other Friday for 3 decades. 3 days a week. Roughly 9 hours a day, door to door, including the drive to pick up Eli from his half-day preschool. 52 weeks a year, minus the handful of days they'd actually taken the kids elsewhere. At the market rate for a qualified in-home childcare provider in our area, I looked it up, $28 an hour, which is frankly conservative for someone with my patience and my toast-cutting skills I had provided over 18 months, somewhere in the neighborhood of $54,000 worth of professional childcare. For free. While being called on a phone call I wasn't even supposed to hear, just free childcare. There was a fifth detail, too, one I hadn't let myself count as a sign until that weekend, because on its own it had seemed too small to matter. Back in February, I'd had a minor car accident, nothing serious, a fender bender in a grocery store parking lot, but enough that my car was in the shop for 4 days, and I had no way to get to Danny and Rachel's house on my usual mornings. I called Rachel to explain, expecting her to say, naturally, not to worry about it. Instead, there was a long pause on the line and then, okay, let me see who else I can call. Not, are you okay? Not, that sounds scary. Just an immediate pivot to the childcare gap, as though I'd called to report a scheduling inconvenience rather than a car accident. She found a neighbor's teenage daughter to cover 2 of the 4 days and paid her, I later learned from Danny, $18 an hour, cash, no questions, arranged within an hour of getting off the phone with me. It wasn't the money that stung. It was how effortlessly Rachel could locate $18 an hour for a 16-year-old with no experience, the same afternoon, without a second thought, and how it had never once occurred to her, in 18 months, that the woman with 3 decades of professional payroll experience, raising her own son single-handedly might be worth at least that much consideration. The sixth sign, though I didn't fully register it as a sign until much later, happened on my own birthday, back in the fall. Danny called that morning to wish me a happy birthday, and somewhere in the middle of the call, almost as an afterthought, he asked whether I'd mind having Eli that evening so he and Rachel could go out to dinner, just the 2 of us. We haven't had a date night in forever. I said yes, of course, because that's what I do. I watched Eli that evening on my own birthday, while my son and daughter-in-law went to a restaurant to celebrate their own relationship. Nobody brought me a cake. Nobody suggested celebrating a different night instead. It didn't occur to either of them, I think, that there was anything strange about asking the birthday girl to provide the childcare that made their evening possible. I ate a frozen dinner at my kitchen table after Eli fell asleep on the couch, and I told myself, the way I'd told myself a dozen times that year, that it was fine, that families do this, that I was being oversensitive. I wasn't being oversensitive. I was simply the only person in the family who hadn't yet noticed that my time had quietly stopped belonging to me on days that were supposed to be mine. I sat with that number for a long time that Saturday evening, long after Eli and Poppy had gone home, long after the kitchen had gone quiet, and the only sound left in the house was the refrigerator humming the same tune it's hummed since Frank bought it in 2009. I thought about 31 years of payroll work, of making sure 211 other people were paid fairly, on time, to the penny, for every hour they gave a company that would have replaced them in a week if they hadn't shown up. And I thought about how I had spent 18 months giving my own family the one thing I'd spent my entire career making sure nobody else ever had to give away for free. My time, undervalued, unacknowledged, and unpaid. There's a difference between loving your grandchildren and being treated like a line item nobody has to budget for. I decided, right there at that table, legal pad still open in front of me, that I would keep showing up for Eli and Poppy exactly the way I always had, because I love them, and none of this was ever their fault. But Rachel and Danny were about to discover, very precisely, in writing, exactly what free had actually been costing them. I had 11 days before the next family gathering, Danny's birthday dinner, which Rachel had already started planning with her usual efficiency, complete with a group text about keeping it simple this year, just family. I used every one of those 11 days. Move 1 that Monday. I called my old friend Diane, who ran a licensed in-home daycare for 22 years before retiring, and asked her, casually, what she'd charged in our area for 2 children under 4, part-time. She gave me a number almost identical to the one I'd already calculated, $26 to $30 an hour depending on age and hours, higher for a nanny with early childhood credentials, which, as it happens, I do have. From a continuing education course I took years ago when I briefly considered working at Eli's future preschool. Diane also mentioned something I hadn't thought of. Professional childcare providers typically itemize hours, dates, mileage, if applicable, supplies. If you ever wanted to make a point, she said, laughing, clearly sensing exactly what kind of call this actually was, make it undeniable. Numbers people can argue with feelings. Nobody argues with a spreadsheet. Move 2, that Tuesday. I did something I probably should have done 18 months earlier. I sat down and actually read through my old employee handbooks from the manufacturing company, the ones I still had boxed up in the garage from my payroll years, just to remind myself what a fair, professional arrangement between 2 reasonable parties actually looks like on paper. Overtime clauses. Holiday differentials. Sick day policies. It felt almost absurd, applying corporate structure to grandmothering, and yet by the end of that evening I understood, with total clarity, exactly how far outside any reasonable arrangement my current situation actually sat. Move 3, that Wednesday. I opened the notebook I'd kept, almost by accident, for the past year and a half, the one where I jotted down which days I had the kids, what time I picked them up, what time Danny or Rachel actually came to collect them. Usually 40 to 50 minutes past the agreed time, I discovered, once I actually added it up. I spent 2 evenings turning 18 months of scattered notebook entries into a clean spreadsheet. Date, hours, children present, notes. The total came to just over 1,900 hours. Move 4, that Friday. I drove to the office supply store and bought a single sheet of professional invoice paper, the kind with a clean header, a line for services rendered, a line for hours, a line for rate, and a line at the bottom for total due. I typed it up that evening on my old desktop computer, the same one I'd used to print 2 decades of pay stubs for other people's families. At the top, I wrote, Barbara J. Whitfield, Childcare Services. Below that, client, Daniel and Rachel Whitfield. Below that, service period, January 2025, June 2026. Hours, 1,912. Rate, $28 per hour. Total due, $53,536. At the very bottom, in smaller print, I added one line that took me longer to write than the rest of the invoice combined. Payment not actually requested. Just wanted you to see the number you've been calling free. I folded it, put it in an envelope, and set it on my kitchen counter, the same counter where, 18 months of babysitting ago, nobody had ever once left me an envelope of their own. That Saturday, the day before the drive over for Danny's birthday dinner, I did one more thing I hadn't originally planned. I called my sister Joanne and told her everything: the phone call, the math, the invoice sitting folded in its envelope on my counter. I half expected her to tell me I was overreacting, the way I'd been telling myself for months. Instead, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Barbara, I've been watching you disappear into that family for a year and a half. I'm glad you finally noticed too." She asked if she could be there for dinner. I told her I'd already assumed she would be at Danny's birthday dinner. Rachel had, true to her word, kept it simple, which turned out to mean 12 people instead of 20, a taco bar instead of a catered spread, and, notably, an offhand comment to the group chat 2 days earlier that read, "Barbara, since you'll already have the kids Thursday anyway, mind just bringing them straight here instead of us picking them up? Saves us a trip, LOL." I brought the kids straight there. I also brought the envelope. Dinner went the way Whitfield family dinners usually go: loud, warm, slightly chaotic, Eli narrating his own meal in a stream of consciousness only a 3-year-old can sustain. Poppy banging a spoon against her high-chair tray with the joyful violence of a drummer who has just discovered rhythm. Rachel's parents were there. My sister Joanne, back safely from her eventual, much-delayed Charleston trip, sat across from me with the particular knowing look of a woman who'd heard the full Monitor story secondhand and had been waiting all week to see what I'd do with it. Dessert came out, a store-bought cake, candles, the usual chorus of happy birthday, slightly off-key. Danny blew out his candles. Everyone clapped. And in the small lull that follows every birthday cake, the lull where people start reaching for coffee and second slices, I reached into my bag instead. "Danny," I said, sliding the envelope across the table to him, "happy birthday. This one's actually for both of you." He opened it, a little puzzled, clearly expecting a card. Rachel leaned over to look at the same moment he unfolded the invoice, and I really watched, the way you watch a number finally land on someone as her eyes moved down the page. Hours. Rate. Total due. "Mom, what is this?" Danny said slowly. "It's an invoice," I said, keeping my voice exactly as pleasant as it had been all evening. "For childcare services rendered over the last 18 months. I'm not actually asking you to pay it, in case that line at the bottom wasn't clear. I just thought you should both see, in writing, what I've apparently been providing for free." Rachel's face had gone very pale. "Where did this number even come from?" 1,912 hours, I said. "I kept a log. I'm a payroll administrator, Rachel. I kept payroll records for 211 employees for 31 years. It didn't occur to me not to keep one for myself." Joanne, across the table, said nothing, but I saw her set down her fork with the deliberate stillness of someone who did not want to miss a single word of what came next. Rachel's father, who had been quiet through most of dinner, cleared his throat. "How much are we talking, exactly?" He asked, not unkindly, the question of a man who, I suspected, had done a bit of payroll math himself in his working years. $53,536, I said. "Give or take." I rounded conservatively. The number landed on the table like a dropped plate. Rachel's mother actually put a hand to her chest. "I overheard you on the phone with Amanda a couple weeks ago," I continued, still gently, still evenly, while I had Eli asleep on my shoulder in your kitchen. "You called me basically just free childcare. You mentioned I bring my own snacks, which I do, by the way, out of my own grocery budget, because it never came up that maybe you'd want to cover that." Rachel's mother, sitting beside her, went very quiet. Danny's face had gone through several colors in the space of about 10 seconds, settling finally on something like shame. "Mom, we didn't mean it like that," Danny started. "I know you didn't mean it cruelly," I said, "and I meant that. I don't think either of you sat down and decided to take advantage of me. I think it just happened, the way these things happen a little bit at a time, until nobody noticed how big it had gotten. But I noticed. Eventually." And I wanted you to see the number, in writing, the same way I'd have wanted any of my 211 employees to see it if somebody had quietly stopped paying them and started calling it a favor. Rachel was quiet for a moment, staring at the invoice like it might rearrange itself into something less true if she looked at it long enough. "The car accident," she finally said, very softly, almost to herself. "I called a 16-year-old within an hour. I didn't even ask if you were okay." "No," I agreed. "You didn't." She stopped, swallowed. "That's actually worse than the phone call, isn't it?" "I think so, yes," I said. The phone call was thoughtless. The teenager was a choice. Joanne, who had promised me on the phone the night before that she'd stay quiet unless I needed her, apparently decided this was the moment she was needed. "Can I add one thing?" she said, not really asking. "Barbara's birthday. This past fall. She spent it watching Eli so the two of you could have a date night. Did either of you know that?" Rachel's mother turned to her daughter with an expression I can only describe as maternal horror. "You had her babysit on her own birthday?" "I didn't," Rachel started, then stopped, clearly running back through the memory in real time and not liking where it led. "I forgot it was even a big deal. I thought we asked, and she said yes, so I did say yes," I said. "I always say yes." "That was rather the point of tonight, Rachel. I wanted you to see what saying yes had actually been adding up to, since none of you seemed to be counting. I didn't raise my voice at any point during that dinner. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect a story like this to end with someone storming out, or a plate getting slammed down, or a dramatic exit into the night. That's not what happened. That's not who I am, and frankly, it's not the example I want to set for Eli and Poppy as they get old enough to understand what fairness actually looks like." I simply folded my napkin, looked at Rachel and then at Danny, and laid out, calmly, exactly what came next. "I'm still going to help with Eli and Poppy," I said. "I love them, and none of this was ever their fault, and I have no intention of disappearing from their lives over an invoice. But going forward, we're going to actually talk about a schedule, a real one, agreed to in advance, not assumed. If you need me for a scheduled day, that's family, and I'm glad to give it. If you need extra, last minute, or full day coverage beyond what we've actually agreed to, we're going to talk about a fair contribution, even if it's partial, even if it's small. And Rachel, I'd appreciate it if, going forward, free isn't the word you reach for when you talk about what I do for this family." Rachel's father spoke up again, quieter this time, addressing his daughter rather than me. "Your mother and I paid a nanny share for 2 years when you were little. It never once occurred to us that it should be free just because we loved the woman who did it." "I'm not sure why it occurred to you here." Rachel didn't have an answer for that. She just nodded, slowly, the kind of nod that comes after a truth has actually landed rather than just been heard. Rachel, to her credit, didn't get defensive. She looked, for a long moment, genuinely stricken, the particular expression of someone who has just realized they've been quietly unkind for a long time without ever intending to be. "I'm sorry, Barbara," she said, and her voice actually shook a little. "I really am. I don't think I ever let myself think about it as work. You just showed up every time, and it was easy to stop noticing what that actually cost you." "That's usually how it happens," I said. "Nobody plans to undervalue the people who show up reliably. It just quietly becomes the plan, because you never have to think about a problem nobody's complaining about." Danny reached over and took my hand, an old habit from childhood, one he hasn't done in years. "We'll figure out an actual schedule," he said. "And Mom, thank you. For real. Not just for the last 18 months. For today, too." I needed to actually see the number. 2 weeks later, I want to tell you about one more scene, because I think it matters more than the dinner did, even though it was quieter and nobody but the two of us was there to see it. Rachel called on a Tuesday afternoon and asked if she could stop by, just her, no kids. She showed up with a coffee for me and one for herself, and she sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd once done the math that started all of this, and she didn't say much at first. She just turned her cup around in her hands a few times. "I looked up daycare costs for real," she finally said. "Not just to check your number. I mean, I actually called 3 places this week. Full-time for 2 kids under 4 runs almost exactly what you calculated. I think some small, petty part of me always assumed you were exaggerating, even after I saw the invoice. You weren't. I wasn't, I agreed. I keep thinking about the car accident thing, she said. I've replayed it about 40 times since dinner. I called a teenager before I asked if you were hurt. I don't know how I let myself become someone who'd do that. You didn't become anyone, I said. You were just busy and tired, and I made it easy for you not to think about it. That's not an excuse for you. It's just the truth about how these things happen. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to undervalue their mother-in-law. It happens one small, unexamined choice at a time until the pattern is just the water you're swimming in. She was quiet for a while after that. Then she asked, a little shyly, if I still wanted to keep watching Eli and Poppy at all, given everything. Of course I do, I said. I never stopped wanting to. I just wanted you to see me while I was doing it. That, I think, was the real ending of this story, not the invoice, not the dinner, not even the schedule we eventually worked out. Just 2 women at a kitchen table, finally looking directly at something they'd both been careful not to look at for a year and a half. A month later, Rachel and I sat down together, no lawyers, no invoices, just coffee at my kitchen table. The legal pad between us instead of an accusation. We built a real schedule. 2 set mornings a week, clearly agreed, with a small monthly contribution for groceries and gas that Rachel insisted on herself, unprompted, before I ever had to raise it again. Extra days still happen sometimes. Grandparents' extra days always do, but now somebody actually asks, out loud, instead of assuming. I still watch Eli and Poppy. I still make his toast into triangles. I still love every single one of those mornings, exactly as much as I did before any of this happened. But here's what I learned, at 66 years old, after 31 years of making sure other people's time was counted fairly. Love isn't supposed to mean your time doesn't count. You can give your family everything you have to give and still expect them to notice what it costs you.